And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Just took my first spring bicycle ride. It was absolutely gorgeous. The weather here has been beautiful. We're finally getting some spring. All the trees are leafing out, and the grass is getting high, and it's California's green, which doesn't last that long, so I enjoy it while I can. How are you doing?
Good, good. It's warming up here, so that was nice. Yesterday it was in the high 60s, which will not
Mhm.
last. We know it's going to be for a day or two, but that's okay. We'll take it when we can. Exactly. I I read something very interesting. The Washington Post had printed, they have a Capital Weather Gang as their weather team, and they posted a thing saying the different stages of winter and spring. And there's like winter one, and then full
Yes,
summer, which is usually
yes.
January that it gets warm, winter two, and then this is the winter of, or the spring of deception is what this is called right now. The spring of deception, where everybody thinks it's going to be spring, but it's not. And then it gets cold again. And then it's like winter three. And then finally, yay, it's spring. So when I saw that, I said, I get fooled every year on this time, just like everybody. So I said, okay, I'm going to remember that. The spring of
The
deception. And
spring of
anybody,
deception.
and I'm sure up north, some of our friends who are further up north are getting
Oh,
walloped.
walloped.
This year has
Absolutely.
been a crazy,
Absolutely.
crazy year weather-wise.
Yep.
So we're going to be talking today about the foot. We decided that we haven't really covered this. It's funny. Nora and I have a list of topics that we want to cover. And this is one of those that's been on there for a while. And we've always sort of pushed it off. We'll cover that next month. So finally, it
Later.
was like,
Later.
look, let's just do it. We want to. It's so cool. One of the best classes that I taught at a conference was sort of a last minute class, and someone backed out and they said, "Oh, could you teach a class on the lower leg and ankle?" Sure, why not? I was like, all right. And I did a lot of research on it. I was fascinated. I said, you know what? This is really a fascinating topic that not a whole lot of people cover. I think it's covered more now since barefoot technology has come about. But it's a fascinating topic. So I think it's about that time.
It is definitely about that time. And I'm reminded because I just taught an advanced movement principles for the lower body in Southern California. And part of that is looking at the foot and the lower leg. And this was a group of experienced Pilates teachers. And it was like a lot of the things I said about the foot were kind of new. And
Mhm.
that's in Pilates land where we do talk about the foot.
A lot.
Fitness land, for the most part, is done in shoes.
Mhm.
And yeah, barefoot technology exists, but it is really a fringe. It's not the mainstream by any means.
Yep.
So most people I know in fitness work in a pretty supportive shoe, meaning they don't do a lot with their feet dynamically. Like they just, they run or they walk or whatever, but they're
Yep.
not really using the full potential of the foot and the ankle.
Yeah, yeah. So we thought this would be perfect for that. But before we get into that, do us a favor, hit the like and subscribe button on the platform of your choice. We really appreciate it. Comment, share, do all those things. We really, really appreciate it. It comes in handy when it comes to those algorithms. You can always reach us at movingconvos@gmail.com or on our Instagram. That's where we're most active, Moving Convos on Instagram. All right, let's dive in. Let's dive into the foot.
Right. So, as I started to say before I was so purposefully interrupted by actual stuff that we have to talk about to keep y'all moving in the right direction. The importance of the foot, right? That this is the foundation of what else happens up above that, which is everything. If the
Yep.
foot is working well, if the mechanics of the foot and the ankle are working as well as they can, that helps the knee, it helps the hip, it helps the back, it helps performance, it helps speed, it helps everything.
Yep.
So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about it. And it's also the foot is super simple in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Strengthening the foot, changing the foot, like you don't have to do a lot to make some really big changes in the foot.
Yeah. And you're right. In fitness land, we are in shoes almost all the time. It's something that I've always taken for granted. And it wasn't until I got into a Pilates studio that when they say take off your shoes, I'm thinking, why? That was my first thing. Why? I mean, this was 20 years ago or something. They say, well, we do this without shoes on. I say, and I got very uncomfortable. And I have nothing wrong with my feet. It's just I'm not used to doing that. So it was
Right.
very interesting to sort of engage and, how should I say this, connect with the ground in a very different way. In a very
Yep.
different way. I had a different connection where shoes don't provide that. And I think you were the
Yep.
first person to remind me that, like your hands, they're a sensory organ.
Major proprioceptive organ.
Yeah.
Meaning there's a lot, and I don't remember the numbers, there's crazy numbers. There's an amazing amount of proprioceptive nerve endings in the bottom of our feet. It's huge because every single step you take, if you think about not that long ago, before the days when we all wore these, nice little casts on our feet like shoes, our feet were designed to respond to uneven surfaces, to cobblestones, having spent a lot of time in Europe, to
Yep.
sand, to rocks, to dirt, to tree roots, right? To different surfaces. And so the foot is designed to have that ability to accommodate to all those different surfaces underneath it and not to let that like throw them off balance up above that. Right. So kind of keep yourself over your feet while your feet are doing all this stuff. Your hips and your knees can go, yeah, I'm good because my feet are
Mhm.
doing all the work to accommodate. So they have a huge amount of information. Every time your foot hits that ground, I say every time your foot hits that ground, it tells everything else above it what to do.
Yeah. And anybody who's walked on ice, anybody who's gone on a
Yeah.
hike where you're walking
Yep.
on tree roots. I come from Hawaii where walking on lava rock was not
Yeah.
something that I was unfamiliar with. I did that as a kid all the time and climbing up mountains and things. So, and we were barefoot a lot as kids. So it never
Yeah.
bothered us. Our feet were very tough. I could never do that now. I'd have shredded meat for feet. But, back then, you really do sort of conform to your environment, and we were great. I mean, we had no problems doing that.
Yeah. And me too. I grew up in Southern California. And the first thing I would do when I walked in the house was throw off my shoes and spent most days, honestly, without shoes on, unless I had to go to school or to do something. And that's also really important developmentally. The amount of work that the brain does to integrate the information from our feet is really significant in terms of developing good balance later in life and good kind of myofascial balance around the whole lower limb. Minor pet peeve of mine. I have a whole bunch of baby grandnieces and nephews, and they often put them in these shoes that are like a
He's
little
so
mini
cute. But
high
yeah.
top. They're so cute, but the feet don't have any ability to move in that thing. And it's like what's really important in those very, very early days when somebody's learning how to walk is how do you use the feet?
Mhm.
Move the ankle, move the toes, get that feeling of how that actually works and understanding the strength that and the potential of the foot. And when you put them in a little brick, you lose all of that, which is really actually is important for brain development and for kind of myofascial balance and balance.
Yeah. I remember when my children were that young, we didn't put them into real shoes probably until 4 or 5. They had these,
Yeah.
like, moccasins that still
Yeah,
protected their
exactly.
feet from what they needed to
Yeah.
be, and that's just what they sold in the stores, but they worked really well for that because their
Yeah.
feet could do, and they climbed, they walked, they did all sorts of things out in the parks and things, and it wasn't until later that it was like, "Okay, we probably need to get them in regular shoes," and if any of you have children, kids' shoes, they're not as soft and pliable as ours are. They don't move hardly at
Well,
all.
they're
They're so
rubber, but
small.
they're only this long, right? So
Yep,
you think about the sole of your shoe, but it's like this long, so it's got
yep.
some give in it. But you take that same material and you shrink it down to, this big, and it is
There's no
literally a brick.
articulation.
There's no
Yeah,
articulation at all, which creates very weak feet, which again just doesn't serve going forward. So
yeah. Yep,
because many people have grown up without that, we want to talk a bit about how the foot works, what you're thinking of in terms of the strength of the foot, and all that.
cool. Alright, let's talk about, some anatomy. You have something to show us.
I have my favorite foot. Nora's favorite foot. And this is my favorite foot because it's really flexible and you can kind of see how all the joints work in it. So one of the things that I really like to do with just talk a little bit about where we are. So this is my tibia. This is my fibula, right? This is coming down from my leg. This is my left big toe, so my left foot. And the first thing I want to talk about is just this ankle joint. this tibio-talar curl joint, where the tibia slides over what's called the talus. This is the talus bone. You see what a nice little ankle range of motion that is? So if you're bending and straightening your knees, flexing and extending, plantar flexing and dorsiflexing your ankle, it's that roll that you're trying to focusing on. Yeah, kind of getting that area to go. And oftentimes we get really stiff here. I've got a lot of clients who really don't have a lot of dorsiflexion particularly. They get really stiff in the front of their ankle, and that actually feeds up into the front of their hip and other things. So that's kind of the first thing, is just that part of the ankle. And then going forward from there, I'm going to talk about this briefly. We'll go into more detail as we go. But that's kind of forward and back, right? As soon as you go farther forward in the foot, you have all this rotational ability. Right. So think about that foot conforming to a tree root, a child's Lego toy, right? Something where you're kind of tripping over something, or you're moving around. So that this is designed to be really stable, right? This is our stability in our foot, is this talar curl joint. And then you've got all this mobility below that, again, designed to help the foot accommodate to whatever uneven surfaces below it.
Yeah. And the interesting thing with that is, and much like the knee joint, when there's not much tension within the foot itself, it's kind of just loose. It's kind of just everything is sort of hanging out, just loose.
Squishy.
And I've actually heard someone say it's just like a bag of bones until force is applied to it and we stand on it, or we get some muscular tension, and then everything sort of pulls back in. What it reminded me of, remember those little toys when we played with as kids where you push the bottom and the guy who's standing up suddenly collapses?
Yes.
And then you let it go and everything comes back up and he stands up straight. That's kind of how I thought of the foot, in that
that's a great
as
idea.
soon as you apply some tension, boom, it's there. It's there to support you. But without it, the only thing really holding it together, because the muscles go limp, are the ligament structures, and there's a lot of them there. But the bones really are just sort of hanging there.
They call it loose packed, right? So like when your foot hits the ground, as your foot hits the ground, it's called the windlass mechanism. Your foot hits the ground, they call that loose packed, because like that makes sense, because before really very recently, like the last maybe 125 years, and really in a lot of places, a whole lot less time than that. Right. Every time that foot was going to hit the ground, this had to accommodate to whatever it was landing on. So it didn't want to be rigid. You don't want a rigid foot to land on a cobblestone or a rock that's going to turn your ankle, right? You want it to be able to go kind of conform and be smooth with that. So that's what we call that loose packed. And then as soon as you rise up, lift that heel up, that's called close packed. And this is called the windlass mechanism, which is, a sailing term. But basically, as soon as I bend those toes, everything tensions in the whole foot. And then the idea there is that, and this is a funny concept, but I love this idea, then that whole foot becomes like a lever, because it actually stiffens all the way up through the foot and then up through the leg. And that's what pushes your hips forward to press off the ground, right? I push off the ground. And it's that close packing or that tightening or tensioning of the foot that turns that back leg into a lever. As opposed to, like, if it was all squishy back there, you wouldn't have that power to push off. But because it stiffens, it pushes your hips forward. So that's where that articulation of the feet and that ability to kind of use the toes and use the metatarsals really helps to create power and strength and speed in walking or running.
Yeah. It's interesting too, that with all of that articulation that occurs because of all the bones, because of all the different joints, it really allows us to conform to our environment. Like we were talking about earlier, if you are walking on cobblestones, your foot can roll and come back to neutral. Eric Franklin has some incredible visuals when it comes to this, of like a raft, taking a raft and twisting it one way versus the other. And and each individual bone in the leg being like logs, and how they can all sort of twist on their own. Incredible visuals, because they really do work independently, much like you'd think our fingers in some respects. But all of those joints really do provide that articulation that we need in order to remain stable when we're in a standing position.
One of the things I sometimes like to bring up about that is in those rare cases where somebody loses the use of their hands, right? Some people are able to train their feet to have the same dexterity as their hands, to
Mhm.
write, to draw, to do kind of fine motor work with their feet. So this has the same potential as the hand in terms of both the neurological input and also even in terms of how the individual muscles and things articulate and work on each of the bones.
Yeah.
So think about that for a minute, especially if this is like the foot is a mystery area to you. Right, which for most of us it is. I often think about the foot and go, there is so much potential here that we're not using.
Yeah.
So we have the ability, with honestly, without a lot of work, you can really change the potential of the foot. And I say
Mhm.
that because most of us start at zero. And if you've ever done any kind of weight training on an area where you've never tried to strengthen it before, 0 to 1 is really helpful.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Right.
yeah.
So the foot, most of us start at zero. It's not like our quads or our biceps where we start at like 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 and we're trying to make subtle gains. We're often starting at zero or not very much in information, strength, activation, or mobility here. And we're trying to make just even incremental small gains can make a really big difference here. So we want to encourage you to think about the feet that way.
Yeah. And one of the things to think about is to enhance some of that mobility in some of our older clients and clients that you notice who, as we age, we lose, you mentioned it before, we lose some dorsiflexion and we're not strong enough in our plantar flexion. So it's true. A lot of the clients that we work with are starting at a level 0. So doing anything, and we'll get into some of the practical applications and later, but doing anything really can make huge improvements in a short period of time.
So let's talk just a little more about the different parts of the foot. So we talked a little bit about the ankle.
Yep.
There's something called the subtalar joint. So this is the talus. This is my calcaneus. So guys, and I know if you're listening, just imagine if you can, because I've got pictures up on YouTube. We're doing a lot of show and tell today, right? So this is a really complicated joint. Here's the bottom of my talus. Here's the top of my calcaneus. There's a lot of things going on there. So in some
Mhm.
ways, this is also creating stability between the ankle and the foot. But if I come sort of to the front of this, here's Charlie said that this is kind of the front of my talus. It's really rounded. It's like a little knuckle almost. And that really creates that ability of the entire forefoot to rotate, or really midfoot and forefoot relative to the ankle. Again, that ability to step on a rock and not have your ankle twist. If this was stiff, you would just go over and tear
Yep.
something. But instead, you've got that ability to just accommodate that. One other thing I like to think about here is the arches of the feet and how the arches of the feet work. And one of the things that I also like to think about is the two sides of the foot in relationship to those arches. So I talk about the medial and the lateral foot, that they're two kind of different, they work differently. So the medial side of the foot, the tibia, goes to the talus, goes to what's called the navicular, that's this bone here, goes to the cuneiforms, goes to the first 3 toes. And that whole medial side of the foot is also related to our medial arch, right? Think
And
about
that's
the
the
arch.
side with the big toe.
Yeah, that's the big toe side. And if somebody is, pronated and supinated, we'll talk about that in a minute, right? If somebody has a very flat foot, that arch is less buoyant, if you will, or
Mhm.
less springy than somebody who has a slightly, I would say, a normal arch. Somebody with a very high arch on the medial side is often a very stiff foot, which has its own issues. It can be
Yep.
super lax and kind of smish down and flatten out, and not have spring and resiliency. It can be kind of a nice normal arch, which has a lot of spring, or it can be a really super high arch, which also doesn't have any spring, but tends to be more on the stiff side. Again, those are just options. Coming to the lateral side, we've got our calcaneus, our heel bone, going to our cuboid, which is a really key kind of arch keystone in the arch of the foot, and then coming down through the 4th and 5th toes. Yeah, and that's our lateral arch. Then again, I know you don't all have access to the visuals, but just imagine this going from our first toe across to our 5th toe, both at the metatarsals and then even more back at the very back of the foot. where the metatarsals meet the rest of the foot, is a big arch. This is our whole transverse arch that really holds our foot up. And the reason that I mentioned the arches, I know I'm getting a little long-winded here. Sorry, Brian. The
Mhm.
reason I mentioned the arches is because arches are what create the spring in our foot. Arches in a structure, like in an archway, right? That little keystone is designed to spread those forces out and allow them to stay stable. In our feet, they're designed to create that spring that we can kind of that arch can flatten out like it does when we step on it, and then it can spring back up. That resilience is a lot of what we're looking to develop in the feet, is that springiness of all of those arches, so that it has that ability to respond kind of dynamically to a jump or a step or a run or a push off, and really get that nice propulsiveness in the foot.
And I think a lot of people don't realize that we have multiple arches in the foot. Most people, if you hear about arches, they think of the big toe arch. They think of the medial
Right.
arch immediately because that's the one that most people are familiar with. If you're going to put an arch support in, that's usually what they do is they put it underneath that part of the foot. When I
Right.
first learned years and years ago about the transverse arch as well as the lateral arch, it was sort of a wow moment because you don't hear about those very often, if at all, because a lot of times we don't need it because
Yeah.
our shoes provide so much of our support. So we're not really working those nearly as much as we probably should.
One of the things I'm going to bring up here, which is very controversial, so I'm just going to say it, and I'm going to talk through kind of both sides of it because I want to bring this up quickly. Um, when some people talk about the feet, and particularly fitness people talk about the feet, you have a lot of different viewpoints that are kind of strong. So I just want to mention them and where we are in the continuum
Mhm.
of foot
Yep.
controversies. There is the whole barefoot stream, right? Which says ideally you should really use your feet. You should maximize the functionality of the feet through having minimal support, in your walking, in your running, in your daily activities. Okay, that's one strong school, and if you've listened to them, they're pretty intent that this is how you should be. On the other
Mhm.
hand, you have people, and I'm not going to name any, I'm going to leave brands out of this because I want to keep pretty neutral here. But there's other shoes which really have like massive cushion, massive support, like, resisting roll, anti-pronation shoes, which really keep the foot in a particular position and
Mhm.
cushion it for whatever it's going to be doing. Right? You got both those,
Yep.
both those. One of
Huge
the things I
spectrum.
would huge speed and everything in between, right? Everything in
Mhm.
between. Some people like a little more mobile and this all that. So one of the things that I want to throw out here is, in the ideal universe, if you had grown up using your feet and were really competent with being barefoot, and you had kind of, your feet got like Brian's feet, my feet too. Like I could step on all kinds of stuff as a kid because I was barefoot all the time. So I got those nice calluses on the bottom of my foot. Now, I'm with Brian. I like walk on, decomposed granite. I'm like, oh, um, right. So if
Yep.
you've got those feet that have developed and you've worked with them and they're strong, then I think going to a barefoot walking and running shoe makes some sense because your feet already have the strength to do that, potentially anyway.
Yep.
I can't tell you, and I'm sure Brian's had this experience too, how many of my clients, saw a podcast or watched a YouTube thing and got to be in their bonnet that they were going to become a barefoot runner. It was better for you. They were going to go there.
Yep.
And they just like threw out their old running shoes, got some barefoot running shoes and started to train like from, a heel lift and cushion to no heel lift and no cushion and no arch support. And they ended up with plantar fasciitis, with the various kind of Achilles tendinitises, because the foot was just not prepared for that radical a change.
I had a client who came to me, and that's exactly what had happened. But hers was suggested and almost forced upon her by her doctor.
Yeah.
She had a
Yeah.
physician who told her, I don't know why you're running. And she was a triathlete. This is not someone who does not
Oof.
run. She was a high level triathlete. And she came to me and said her doctor said to put on these shoes because I saw them and I thought, okay, interesting. It was at the beginning of sort of the
The
barefoot running
barefoot craze.
stages.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it was. And so I looked at it, okay. And come to find out, she went from 0 to 60, right away, started running with these and hadn't stopped. Well, she tore her tibialis posterior completely off the bone.
Mm.
And she couldn't run anymore. She was really having a really hard time and tons of pain. And I
Yeah.
said, well, yeah, you've lost a lot of support in your leg, in your foot, and your foot is collapsed now where it wasn't before. And I said, you got to work into that. It may be a goal to obtain, but it's not something to go overnight. And we saw
Mhm.
that with so many brands coming out saying that this is
Mhm.
the only way to do it, much like, and this is again for more runners. Some people said, oh, you have to stop running the way you are and just run on your toes, or stop running, never have a heel strike and all this kind of thing. It's like, look, I've been in shoes since however long it's been. Don't tell me to run
Mhm.
barefoot now because my feet aren't ready for that. They got to work up
Exactly.
to it,
Exactly.
you
I mean,
know?
one of the things I say about the feet, and that relates directly to this, is our feet, all the tension patterns in our feet. So our myofascial stress patterns in our feet, our muscular strength, our tendon length, all of those are created by a very repetitive activity, which is walking and running and standing. Most of us, even if we sit at our jobs all day, the main thing we do on our feet is walk and stand.
Yep.
So, our feet, even with a minimal amount of work in somebody's ordinary semi-sedentary life, that's the only feedback and stimulation those feet get. So with whatever shoes they're wearing, right? So that's going to create the length of all those fibers, the length of the muscle fibers, some of the length of the tendons, the tension patterns in the foot, and the alignment of the foot.
Yep.
And that, like any myofascial pattern, you want to change that gradually over time. If you try to go from like a little bit of a heel lift to flat, like even just that shift, because most tennis
Mhm.
shoes or most running shoes have a bit of a heel lift, that's going to change the tension patterns through the whole underside of the foot just
Yep.
right away. And that's going to change how those arches work, how all that myofascial tension works through the whole underside of the foot. So any of those changes, especially if you're, a regular runner or a walker or do long distances or at repetition, gradual
Mhm.
changes are what are necessary for the body to accommodate. It can accommodate, but it takes time. And you've
Yeah.
really got to give it that time.
It's like building up any muscle. You don't wanna go out and do a high intensity interval training thing when you haven't even gotten off the couch in the last 5 years. Because guess what?
Exactly.
You're not only gonna be so sore tomorrow, chances are in a short period of time, you're gonna get injured. And
Hmm.
that's just what's going to happen. And
Yeah.
it's the same thing. And you said it perfectly. When you build up all of those myofascial fibers in a certain direction to accommodate what you do on a regular basis, much like what we do, with our postural habits and everything else, to suddenly erase that and force it to do something that it's not accustomed to. And especially with our weight, just imagine someone who might be
Yeah.
200
This
pounds,
is like
250 pounds.
gravity. Yeah.
Holy moly, coming down hard on that. Oh, yeah, it's going to do nothing but cause problems.
Right. So when we think about foot strengthening and we try to get the foot more functional, and also again, just thinking back on the workshop I just did, um, these are people who had been, I think, thinking about their feet because that
Mhm.
does come up in Pilates, and
Sure.
the light bulbs that went off with what I thought of as some fairly like things that maybe I thought they understood already was interesting. And I think that's pretty common in all of fitness land, is just really the feet are a wonderful place to just do some very simple things that make some really interesting changes.
Mhm.
So starting with the foot as opposed to the ankle, we'll kind of do both, but thinking about the foot, the first thing I often think about is two things. One is, can you move your toes? Okay. So I know this is simple, but I'm going to have you do two things. Wherever you are, if you're in your car, be cautious, but otherwise you should be okay. Like first, just tap your toes, lift all your toes up into toe extension and put them down. Just lift
Mm.
and down, lift and down. When I'm working with older people who are starting to shuffle their feet and really not lift,
Mm-hmm.
go into dorsiflexion. Oftentimes when I have them do this, they can't lift their toes. So they've
Yep.
lost both toe extension and then they've also lost dorsiflexion because those are related activities. So just like, tap your toes. That's a really nice, simple way to get those toes getting a little bit stronger and to strengthen the whole front of the leg, really simply. Then to take that the other direction, that's toe extension. Let's do one more thing on toe extension. Another thing you can do is what I call play piano. So you lift your toes up and you're going to put one toe down at a time. Up, one, starting with your little toe, notice. If you try starting with your big toe, it's going to be big toe, four little toes. Big toe, if you can do that, right? So you go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right. So just that very simple exercise starts to get some mobility, some awareness, and even some strength in a part of the foot that may be really sleepy.
Mm-hmm. Those are great ones. There's a medical test, muscle test that is done called Jack test or Jack's test, where literally they want to see, can you stand on your foot and can you elevate your big toe? Can you lift it? And some people are so tight that they can't lift it at all. And that's an active version. Passive version is, can the doctor or a physical therapist lift it? And a lot of times it can't even be lifted. It is so tight. So a lot of times what I'll have some people do is I say, you're sitting watching TV, you're at your desk, whatever. If your shoes are off, bring your foot up and just pull your toes back to stretch them. Just pull them back passively. Because for some people, they are so tight in the bottoms of their feet that they can't do that comfortably. But after a short period of time, few weeks, month or so, they're going to see a great change in the amount of extension those toes can, really do. And it's really important.
And so if you remember what I said earlier about that closed pack, that windlass mechanism, that push off phase of pushing your hips forward at the back of that stride is dependent on some toe mobility and extension.
Yeah.
Right. And that's also something that's missing in a lot of shoes. So that's the other issue with a lot of shoes. If a shoe has a really stiff sole, and I honestly, I like my shoes. Brian knows that about me. So some of my shoes are like stiff leather soles. They don't really allow that articulation at the metatarsals. So when I'm wearing those shoes, I know I can't get as good a stride because I can't push off those toes. I'm kind of just pushing off like my whole toe as opposed to pushing off through the metatarsals. So thinking about just again, getting that range of motion. And to Brian's point, it doesn't take long to get the range of motion because most people haven't tested it at all. They never tried to stretch it. So sometimes just a little bit of stretching will make the difference because they've never done anything. And wake it up. Exactly. It's like they may just have never moved the toe and it's like, oh, it can do that. Sometimes you got to tell your body like, yeah, you can do that. It's okay.
Yep. But I love this sort of thought of playing the piano, the little pinky, because I guarantee that there's going to be a number of people listening to this who are going to try that, and they're going to drop that little pinky and it's going to go plonk like a plank. And they're going to look at their foot and think, I didn't know that.
Right.
And it'll take some time to build that up a little bit. And it may need some passive work first, or even some release work, tennis ball, whatever you got, to really create some of that mobility again in that transverse arch right underneath the toes, where what I call the knuckles, because really that's that first, major knuckle of the fist.
Exactly. These guys
pushing on that, and really trying to, and what I'll do is just have someone find something, even a golf ball or a smaller ball or a soft ball. Some people sell these softer balls, is just put it on the knuckle and then look at it when you're pushing pressures to see if you can see that deformation that the knuckle pushes up. And then you go to the second one and push up. Let's make sure that the knuckles are really moving independently of one another. And then you can start to see some movement that really can make a difference in getting that movement, and to be able to do independently little, fourth, third, second, and then I almost said thumb, big toe.
So let's take this back a moment, Brian, because that was a really good point that I started one step forward. of where I should have started. 0 really is rolling out the bottom of the foot. Right. And again, you can use a tennis ball, you can use a golf ball, you can use one. There's all kinds of nice rolly
Tons of
things. You can use a
stuff.
rolling pin. I was in Russia and one of my teachers there brought in all these basic old fashioned wooden rolling pins with the little
Mhm.
handles. And we use those just to roll out the bottom of our feet and roll out our thighs and everything else. So going for that, working on just getting that mobility, just rolling through the bottom of the foot, rolling through each of the little metatarsal heads, rolling through the heel, rolling through the back of the arch. That does 2 things. 1, it can just help to massage it and relax the foot a little
Mhm.
bit. 2, it radically stimulates the proprioception of the foot. It
Yeah.
really wakes up the sole of the foot so that it can start to respond, because it's
Yep.
like, good morning. Come on, buddy,
Yep.
wake up. Just wakes it
Exactly.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I started doing that, I basically saw a profound change in my performance as well, because I started feeling more of my foot. Before I started
Yeah.
doing much release work, and it was introduced, I wanna say 14, 15 years ago at one of our fitness conferences. I took a class with someone, and it was the first time someone was talking about doing release work on the foot. He was a physical therapist
Mm.
from, New Zealand, and
Yeah.
I started working that. I thought, "Oh my gosh." First of all, the first time I stepped on it, I said, "Ow, that
Yes.
hurts," because
Yes.
I hadn't done it before. But over
Yes.
time, I started really waking the foot up and realizing, wow, I'm really stimulating things I haven't in a long time. And it did help performance. It did help me in what I was doing in the gym, because I could have better connection with whatever I was doing. If I was doing a lunge or a squat or whatever, I really felt as though I had better connection with the ground, even in shoes. And I thought, wow, that's really changed the way I thought about doing release work, because a lot of people are thinking, roll the bottom of my foot. What good is that going to do? It really does wake up the sensory, the proprioception,
Mhm.
and it can provide greater flexibility as well and get those joints to mobilize in ways that, unless you have an incredible spouse who's willing to massage your feet every single night, and if you do,
More
God
power
bless
to
you.
you, man.
That's all.
Keep them. Just keep them.
Keep doing. Keep
Do
them
whatever you
happy.
need to do to keep them happy.
Absolutely. But it's a way to really get that going.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
highly, highly recommend that too.
So again, that's super simple. And I
Mhm.
can't tell you. In fact, I had a number of clients who were tennis players who would just bring me in all of their dead tennis balls.
Yes,
Right. They would just
exactly.
bring in a bag of dead tennis balls every few months or whatever, because they were pretty avid tennis players. And I would just hand them out like popcorn. It was like, take this, put it under your desk at work, and just take your shoes off and roll your feet out.
Yep.
Right. I mean, you can do it anywhere, anytime, dining room table, when you're bored at your office and you're working your 900th email or, whatever, you can just roll your foot out for a few minutes. And that alone is really just a powerful tool. I love, Brian, that you spoke to that. What's really nice about this conversation that I'm enjoying is, again, I grew up as a dancer, and I was a modern dancer. So I was a barefoot dancer from the time I can remember, honestly. And I was a gymnast. So I used my feet all the time
Yeah.
in my activities. And so, I was pretty darn strong actually in my feet and my ankles, and because I used them a lot, like a lot more than most people do.
Yeah.
Um, and so for me, the feet were not a mystery, because I'd been spending years on working on them. Right. But I think Brian really represents the normal person. Like, most
Average.
people are like, feet? Really? What is that about? So I really appreciate that. That's really good insight, and just for me too. And I think for our listeners to understand where people are, because it can really be like at the beginning of the foot journey with you, or they can be
Mhm.
farther along depending on their background and their experience.
And if you think about it, I said it was 15 years ago that I took this class. That was the first time that I can remember at a fitness conference that someone really spoke at length that
Mhm.
wasn't a Pilates instructor.
Yeah.
Because I've been to many Pilates on tours, and they've had, things on the feet and whatnot, and I learned so much from those classes. They're great. But at a fitness conference, everybody wants to do, the hardest exercises and jump on this and throw this and do this, lift this, all that kind of stuff. They're not really focusing on the smaller things that can really make a huge difference in someone's daily life. and their quality of life. And it wasn't until I really took that class and thought, oh, wow, something as simple as this. And this class also was the first time that we started doing release work and things. And now, if you think about it, foam rollers are found at, the grocery store. I mean,
Everywhere.
release work is done all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Yeah.
become, all of that stuff is really becoming much more the norm, but we're not seeing the foot be talked about nearly as much. There are a few people out there, and I'm thinking of a couple of, instructors who really have focused a lot on the foot, and their classes are great. They really do focus on that. I do find, though, sometimes with some of my clients, if the foot is not their issue, it's kind of hard to get them to drink the Kool-Aid on that, to focus on the foot, and say, here, I really need you to do this, unless you can show them where they're deficient and why we need to focus on this. And once I could show them that, that wakes them up. And for an older client, it's pretty easy because they start
Yeah.
shuffling their
Yeah.
feet. If
Yeah.
I just say to an older client, do you know anybody who walks like this? And then I imitate an 80-year-old who doesn't have any plantar flexion or dorsiflexion, shuffling their feet. And almost every one of them says, say, that could be you in 5 years if you don't start really focusing on moving your ankle, moving your foot. And they'll look in their eyes. They're like, got it. So for them,
motivation.
They drink the Kool-Aid quickly. But a younger person may need to really be shown, hey, this is going to help your tennis game. This is going to help your golf game. This is going to help you in all aspects of your life. Fall prevention, all sorts of things.
Yeah. And one of the things too about even just rolling the foot out is that really radically helps balance.
Yeah.
So, you think about fall prevention, you think about fall prevention in all of our people, or people just who have balance challenges for various reasons, like just getting some stimulation there can really help with that. Yep. So we've talked a little bit about extension, a little bit about just mobility work. The next thing is really looking at toe flexion and strengthening the arch of the foot. Mm-hmm. So we've said this a lot. I feel like I've said it at least every episode once. If you immobilize an area, it can take you 3 times as long, roughly, as you've immobilized it to get the strength and the mobility back in the area. So, roughly, whatever. Think about a foot that has been in a shoe, particularly a relatively, like I think about men's, leather-soled shoes. Most of us are in better shoes than we used to be, honestly. If you look at the 50s or whatever, women in like high heels where their foot wasn't moving at all, men in stiff-soled brogues or whatever, where they really weren't moving at all. Now at least most people are in some kind of more flexible shoe, thankfully. But still, they're in a shoe, which is holding their foot in a particular position. Often it has an arch support. So that foot is not having to actually use that spring mechanism I was talking about, right? That little trampoline quality. Instead, it's just held rigidly. Yep. And when something is held rigidly, it becomes immobile. It will lay down more fascia. It will get stiffer. It will lose that pliability. So oftentimes the bottom of the foot is really stiff and weak. And when I start to work on strength in the bottom of the foot, that's where I find most people have some work to do, somewhere to go. That's really not very strong for most people. So Brian mentioned this earlier with the ball, using the ball to pop the knuckles up of basically the knuckles, the metatarsal heads of the feet, like to kind of popping them up, making sure there's mobility there. When I'm doing toe flexion, so if you're with me, okay, if you're still there, feet on the floor, curl your toes under, right? Curl your toes and like you're trying to scrape the ground, right? Or you're trying to, one simple way I do this is I put like a towel under the foot and I'm trying to pull the towel towards me with my toes. Yeah, that's a very simple way to do that. For a lot of you, and take a look at your feet now, are you doing that by actually flexing the toes? So are you actually pulling this way, or are you pulling this way? Basically, are the toe knuckles coming up and you're just pulling it this way? I'm using this with my finger, guys. It looks a little silly, but I'm basically hooking something. Or am I actually pushing my knuckles up and pulling the toes underneath me? Okay. Because if I really want to get that arch of the foot a little stronger, I need to actually pop those knuckles up
Mhm.
when I curl my toes. So when I kind of pull my toes under. And this is something that I work on with all my clients who I'm doing footwork on. And many clients, when they pull their toes in, the second knuckle of the toe pops up, the metatarsal heads do not pop up because they really don't have strength. Like that's not actually toe flexion strength that they're working on there. They really don't have that strength going through the bottom of the foot. So for that, like again, I'll just have them look at their foot and then see if they can actually pop that knuckle up. Sometimes what I'll have them do for that is like take like again a small tennis ball or a golf ball, and we'll do some Instagrams on all these as soon as I get a good pedicure because right now my feet look ridiculous. Anyway, so sorry. I was like, I should do videos on these. I should, but really I got ridiculous looking feet at the best of times. So basically thinking about wrapping the metatarsal like around a ball, like just a little tennis
Mm.
ball or a little softball, and kind of wrapping my foot around it, like I'm trying to dome that foot up. That's a really nice, simple way just to get that arch of the foot a little bit stronger. And once
Nice.
again, like you have somebody do 10 of those on each foot, 10 little piano waves and roll out their feet. I mean, that takes maybe 5 minutes and can again be done at your
Oh,
desk or dining room table. And you've got a really, really nice, simple way to just to start on the path of strengthening your feet and
yep.
preventing a lot of funkiness. Like that is one of my key number ones, like preventing plantar fasciitis is really important, especially for all my runners, because that's a really common problem with runners.
Yep.
And strengthening the feet is step number one.
Yep. Something that I've done, uh, is I like to use marbles.
Yeah, smaller,
And
smaller, harder.
yeah, well, I use 2 things. One, I get the larger, the bambuchas. I get the large marbles as well as the
Okay.
small ones, and I
Okay.
put them on a mat so that they're not gonna roll around because hardwood
Yeah.
floors and whatnot, you're gonna be yeah, they're gonna go all over the
And me
place.
chasing marbles. Yeah.
And I'll have them focus on gripping the marble with
Yeah.
their toes,
Mhm. Yep.
lifting it up off the ground, and then putting it to the side, and then
Yep.
gripping it and put it to the side. Now, most people can do it with the big toe, second toe. And I start with the bigger marble because the smaller marble can be very frustrating unless you have a smaller foot. I
Yeah.
have very large feet. So for me, the smaller ones, I've got long toes. They're a little more challenging, but over time I can get the dexterity back. But again, if they have no dexterity, having them do the larger marble, and then try and do all the different toe joints and see if they can lift it with the second and third, the third and fourth. By the time they get to the fifth, you're lucky if they can lift it at all. Just because we don't have a
Right.
lot of dexterity with that guy,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. But it's another way to get that, and then I'll go down in size. I'll have them get
Mhm.
comfortable doing the larger one, and then just like we're lifting a heavier weight, I'm gonna put a smaller marble there. So now they have to really try and grip that. And you're gonna see they're gonna master the big marble and, "Oh, I got this. This is easy, no problem." And then you put the smaller marble down, "Oh, why can't it's not grabbing. I can't what's." And I say, "Now more articulation, go slower, and you'll see it'll take them a little bit of concentration. You can see the
Yes.
faces scrunch up,
Yes.
and they'll get it. They'll say, "Oh, wow," and their foot will be tired. But
Yeah.
it's something
Yeah.
that's simple, and you for 99
Yeah.
cents, you can get a bunch of them, a
Exactly.
bunch of marbles.
And the key thing there, Brian, was the concentration piece. That again, a lot of times people have not thought about their feet, and just
Yeah.
telling their foot to do something is kind of like what? Like your foot goes what? Like a bad. It's like a bad cell phone, connection. A lot of times, your head is saying, "Pick up that marble," and your toe is going, "Excuse me, did you say marble to pick up? What are you talking about there?" So that concentration is a lot of times very useful too, just creating that mind body connection, which a lot of people don't have to their feet.
And I find that having a wide variety of exercises
Yeah.
makes a difference because if
Yep.
all you do is the towel, they get bored. Towel
Yep.
scrunches, they get bored. If
Yep.
you just have them over the edge of a table curling, they get bored. Whatever it is, people get tired of it. So I have 5, 6, 7 different things that we play with that it's like,
Nice.
"Oh, we'll do marbles today." And they'll say, "Oh, what do you mean we're gonna do marbles?" And then you show them, "Oh, okay." And then, or today we're gonna do the towel scrunch, or sometimes it's making things up on the fly. It's like, okay, I need to have them do this or that.
Right. Let's try this. Yeah.
Now, I'm gonna throw something out there that I like to do with my clients with this as well. Working on stability and getting them to feel all of their foot, super important. I will then have them focus on feeling that in a standing position
Yeah.
so that
Hmm.
they're sometimes I put them on an RX pad, a stiffer RX pad, not a super flexible one that has a little bit more cushioning so that
Yep.
they can actually feel their toes digging in because
Uh-huh.
hardwood floors, you're not going to make an impact. But having them be able to feel their toes digging into, an RX pad or a balance pad of some sort, and just before I even do balance, just have them stand there, feel the entire foot, feel the first toe, the second toe,
Yep.
the third, fourth,
Yep.
fifth toe, feel the knuckles. I've heard the foot triangle be used where the knuckle
Hmm.
under the big toe, under the little toe, and the heel. Make sure you feel all 3 points of the foot triangle. I've heard a number of different philosophies and different ways to cue this, but they all work. And to get someone to finally sort of take that into the practical, because we're doing a lot of things before we get to this point, just waking it up, that now we can get them to stand or even seated and feel their feet. That's really important.
And then the next step for that, if you want to go on to a little bit of a next step on that, is Nancy Myers, who's a great foot person. She has a thing called Walk with Nancy, and we can put that in the show notes. Um, she does something which I kind of love, which is simply from kind of a mini lunge, pressing off that back foot and then coming back down,
Mm,
right? Just one
nice.
leg's forward, one leg's back, knees are a little bit bent. You would just push off that back leg and come back and really feel that articulation of the
Hmm.
toes, feel that stiffening going from like a loose pack to closed pack coming up, and feeling how that leg projects that hip forward. That's
Hmm.
just a lovely way to do that. You can play with that on the reformer. Coraline's wonderful for that. If you got a Coraline by
Yes.
any chance, it's a really, really nice place. Like you think of the hoof in Coraline, that's all about that particular moment. Those of you who know the hoof, it's basically like a pushing the cart back by using exactly that, by pushing the toes into the cart and coming up, lifting the heel up. So thinking about how you can then take that into the work they're doing
Hmm.
is just super, super handy and super helpful. Now, one other little thing here, if you've got clients who do work in shoes, and I know Brian, in your environment, I'm
Hmm.
sure most people work in shoes most of the
Absolutely.
time.
Yep.
Then the other thing too is having them work in their shoes, but still think about some of that articulation.
100%.
Right. So like I won't just do it like I'll do it. I'm in the Pilates environment. So I most have people barefoot. But if I know they spend a lot of time in shoes, like I did this, I worked a lot on this with some of my basketball players. Right. So thinking about
Yeah.
basketball players, right? They typically have high top tennis shoes. They don't have a lot of articulation in that shoe. It's usually pretty stiff. And so, for example, when they jump, they really are jumping a lot from their leg muscles. They're not really using the foot very much. And I remember working with a couple of Cal Berkeley basketball players, which is challenging because they were really tall for the reformers. But there we go. That was a challenge. They couldn't jump very high. But basically, working on them without their shoes first, getting that push off through the toes. So I
Yep.
would have them just start. It would be a straight leg jump, starting straight legged, and then just pushing off, pushing off, pushing off, trying to get the jump just through their feet. Light
Mm, nice.
resistance, not going very high, but just kind of getting that feeling going. And not that you would jump with straight legs, but that's why the resistance is light. You're not going very high. Then I would put them in their shoes so they could still have that sensation of using some of that metatarsal strength in their shoes. And now these guys were already, high level college athletes, but I also worked with some young kids who were in their like basketball camp in the summer. And one kid's jump, I swear to God, it changed by a foot just
Mm,
by understanding how to use the foot, even
sure.
when he was in his shoes. So, those are little like case studies of the value of the foot, very simply using a little more of the foot in a functional activity.
Yeah. Yeah. So getting them, I like the fact that you said getting them back into their shoes,
Yep.
because for so many of our clients, that's what they're in on a regular basis.
Yeah. That's
90%
their
of the day,
environment.
that's how we really need to also train them. So
Yep.
for me, especially, you know, if there are any weights around, I really don't want them being barefoot. I want to have at least a little bit of protection for their feet and whatnot, but also to
Mm.
train them in that environment. So if I'm having them do balance work and all of that, especially for fall prevention or anything, they need to be able to do it in the shoes they wear on a regular basis. But I love
Right.
the fact that you're saying to work the same feeling. And that's what I try and get out of that is if they're doing balance work, 1 foot, or they're doing a lunge, focusing on both the front leg and the back leg, getting that articulation. Something else to think about. You said using the Coraline, which is a fantastic piece of equipment for doing, foot articulation. Also, hardwood floor, just put a towel down and
Right.
have
Or gliding discs or
or
paper
gliding
plates,
disc or whatever
whatever
you got.
works, whatever slides on your surface. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, all of those things will work in whatever environment you have. So it doesn't matter if I know I've heard some people say, well, we can't afford all that fancy equipment. It's like, you don't need it.
I get it. No problem. Yeah.
Not at all. There's so many different things that you can utilize the same way, and they work great. And again, working that articulation is very important, especially if you do have someone who is having a hard time with some of the simple exercises like a lunge. I found that
Mhm.
their lunge looks odd and you can't figure out why. Their hip flexor isn't very shortened. It's fairly flexible. I don't understand what's going on. And you look at the back foot, it's turned
Yeah.
out. They're not bending through the toes. They're,
Yeah.
keeping it flat or it's twisted or whatnot. You're like, oh. And just by correcting that, suddenly everything else begins to change. So the
Yeah.
foot is not something to take lightly. It's something that really some focus needs to be put on in order to, see the rest of the body and see profound changes sometimes through the rest of the body.
So today we're doing this in series now. We've decided we have too much
Yes.
to say on any one topic. So this is step
I
one
was
of the
just
foot.
thinking that. I was
This
like,
is the
this is
foot
part one
introduction.
of many.
This is part one of a couple. So the things we really talked about today really were simply just waking up the foot, toe
Yep.
extension, toe flexion, getting some
Release
mobility
work.
through the foot, release work, and then just thinking about that push off, right? And one thing I wanted to add to that, because I think Brian brought this up, but I just want to think about that. If I'm thinking about a client who is trying to move towards a more mobile foot, right? Like maybe I start with just saying, okay, so keep your tennis shoes, keep your trainers, go for one that's more flexible in the front,
Mhm.
that's got some ability to articulate through the metatarsal. So start with that. Start with just starting to think about how you can push off a little more
Yep.
effectively. So that's
Yep.
kind of just a little piece there. So that's today. That's beginning with our feet. Next time we have the ankle to consider, and we have a whole lot of other like little foot things to play with. And once again, I will get a pedicure and I will show some of these things on our Instagram. I also just want to, this is a little plug, but Fusion Education, I did a little foot thing on them. And it's a little workshop on the foot that has a number of these exercises in it, along with some other ones as well. So there's a little plug for that.
Great. Great. We have send it to me. We'll put it in the show notes.
Perfect.
So, all right. Well, thank you guys for joining us. I hope you learned a lot. It reminded me, I'll be honest, we all get sort of stuck in our own groove of what we do on a regular basis. And sometimes it's good to even remind myself, it's like, yeah, for this person, I kept thinking of clients and thinking, you know what? I'm going to start thinking about it a little bit more even than I do and just wake some things up. So I'm glad that we had an opportunity to talk about this today. And hopefully you did too. Hopefully you learned a lot. Do us a favor, hit that like and subscribe button. We really do appreciate it. Comment when you can. Every comment, every like, every share really helps us out. We really appreciate it. You can always check us out at Moving Convos on Instagram or give us an email at movingconvos@gmail.com. And for Nora St. John, Brian Ritchie, we'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.